This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, we've got some good news out of Georgia on the voting rights front. We all remember SB 202. That was the big omnibus voter suppression law that gained notoriety for making it illegal to give voters waiting online water. Can you talk about what happened when that law went to court?
So great news. A federal judge enjoined, which means blocked, the ban on food and water for people waiting in line outside of 150 feet of the polling place, which is a real victory for voting. It's a shame that this is what we've come to as a society, that Republicans are literally banning giving hungry people food and thirsty people water.
Was there any other parts of that law that didn't succeed once they were challenged in court?
Yeah, so the other piece, which is really big and encouraging news, not just in Georgia, but in other states, is that the federal judge struck down a requirement that you put your date of birth on the outer envelope of the absentee ballot. And if you don't, it's rejected. There's obviously nothing material, is the word in the statute. There's nothing material to voting about putting your date of birth on the outer envelope. I mean, after all, Brian, the state of Georgia knows how old you are, right? Because you're a registered voter. So why do they need you to put the date of birth?
Well, to that point, why do they need you to put your date of birth? Like, what was, and I'm sure this is a nefarious reason, but what is the rationale for them to actually have done that?
Because they want to make it hard to vote and they want to make it easy to throw out people's ballots. And so what you do, if you're trying to make it hard for people to vote and you're trying to suppress the vote, there are a couple of tactics you can see. And we saw both of them at play here in what we were just discussing. The first is you make the voting experience as unpleasant as possible. How do you do that? You make people wait in the Georgia hot sun and heat, and you say, no one's allowed to give you water. But the other thing you do, Brian, is that you create all of these little traps for people so that if they vote, their votes don't count. And since we know that Donald Trump and the Republicans have been targeting vote by mail, they wanted to find a way to throw out absentee mail-in ballots. So they say, we know what we're going to do. We're going to make you complete another part of this ballot by filling in your date of birth. And if you don't, it gives us an excuse to toss your ballot out.
They're going to do these things, and Democrats are going to challenge them in court while they're in effect. And so we're always just playing catch up against these things that they're imposing. Is this just going to keep happening? Are they just going to keep doing illegal things, and then eventually we'll challenge them in court and it'll get rolled back, but then they'll impose some other burdensome requirement and we'll always just be playing catch up with them? Is that what's going to keep happening here?
Look, Brian, I think you've put your finger on the great tragedy facing American democracy right now, which is that as many times as we can sue and win, the legislative printing office at these Republican legislatures is free to them. They can pass new bills, North Carolina, about to override the governor's veto there, and that will mean another voter suppression law in North Carolina. We saw it recently in Ohio. We've seen it in Idaho. We've seen it in state after state. They find new innovative ways to restrict voting rights simply for the sake of restricting voting rights. And I wish I could say there was a solution other than elect Democrats to your state legislatures and encourage them to pass better, more expansive voting laws.
Well, to that point, I mean, what if we pass some type of federal legislation that would prevent this stuff in advance from going into an effect? Do you think that would have any impact? Do you think that's feasible?
Oh my God, that would solve the problem, right? If we got the Freedom to Vote Act passed, if we got the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, I'd be able to retire and go do something else. In fact, my offer to the Republicans out there listening to this podcast, if you stop passing voter suppression laws, I'll stop suing to block voter suppression laws. If Republicans in Congress would join and pass voting rights laws that protect the right to vote, they won't hear from me again.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, these guys have been looking to get you out of their hair for a long time. So that's the answer. Mark, back on SB 202 in Georgia, are there any especially concerning parts of this law that are still in effect?
Yeah, there are lots. I mean, remember, this was an omnibus voter suppression law. This didn't have just one or two pieces. This had a lot. It imposed unnecessary new identification requirements for people voting absentee. It restricted drop boxes, right? The secure metal containers. Georgia joined the Republican war on drop boxes. It banned mobile polling places, which was a technique that was used to decrease long lines by bringing temporary mobile polling locations. It prohibited the state from distributing unsolicited absentee ballot applications. Think about that. A county could not say, we're just going to send people absentee ballot applications, not the ballot, just even an application, unless someone asked for it. It prohibited third-party organizations from collecting absentee ballot applications. You know, the worst provision of a very bad law, as I have called it for a while, it expanded the ability of citizen vigilante groups to disenfranchise their neighbors by challenging them and put the burden on counties and the voters to overcome those challenges. That led, Brian, as you know, to nearly 100,000 Georgians being challenged in the 2022 election. That meant that ordinary citizens got letters from the government saying your right to vote has been challenged. So this did a lot of really bad things. I mean, I haven't even gone through the whole list. It made it so that ballots that were voted out of precinct, unless they were cast after 5 p.m. on election day, got tossed. A lot of really bad things.
Now, I understand the virtue of having these narrow lawsuits that only focus on one or two things that might be relatively easy to win in court, and you don't want to get it bogged down with too much because then it kind of poisons the well and makes it more difficult for the whole lawsuit to succeed if you have a few things that are kind of unsure. But do you anticipate that we'll see more narrow suits against these specific provisions of SB 202 as we continue to, move this process forward?
Yeah, so there are already other provisions of this law that are already being challenged. And in fact, I'll give you a great example. My law firm, we filed a lawsuit earlier this year about yet another provision in SB 202, which you're going to love this, that requires a wet ink signature in order to apply, in order to register to vote. I mean, just imagine this. You have all of these folks doing online voter registration, and e-signatures are a thing, and they are requiring a wet ink signature. Now, why would you put in a law in 2023 for the first time to require a wet ink signature?
I'll tell you why. Because you'd be hard pressed to find anyone in Gen Z who even owns a printer. That's why.
Correct. That's right. And because our client in that case, vote.org, allows Gen Z voters to register online. And this was a way to make that harder.
Yeah. Now, on the food and water front, because this was such a major story as it was happening, can you talk about why it was necessary and how long some of the lines were in the last Georgia election?
Yeah. So, look, we have a tremendous problem in this country of long lines, but it is a problem that targets only certain communities. Let's just speak clearly. The populations that tend to face long lines are Black voters and young voters, college campuses, and where there are Black voters. There's a study of long lines in Georgia in the primary in the 2020 primary election. And here's what it found. If you were in the 6 metro Atlanta counties and you were in a precinct that was 90% or more registered Black voters, you waited in line an average of 51 minutes. If you were in the same 6 counties, same election, and you were in a precinct that was 90% or more white voters, the average wait time was 6 minutes. 6 minutes versus 51 minutes.
Almost a 10-time wait.
Yeah, that's why they banned food and water to wait in line, because if you're waiting 6 minutes, you don't have time to drink food, eat food or drink water, right? It was meant to punish Black voters. So now fast forwarding and answering your question about the last election, in the 2022 election, the election which was a midterm, not a presidential. So you can just imagine what it would be like in a presidential year. But in the midterm election, the court, in his opinion, the judge cited that in Fulton County, there were more than 20 polling locations that had more than an hour wait time. So again, I don't have the racial breakdown, but I would bet you if you look at those places in Fulton County, I can predict with pretty high certainty what you're going to see, which again are severe racial disparities. But we see this all throughout the country. One of the reasons why banning food and water in line was a thing in Florida, you may remember, and it's been in laws elsewhere, and why you see places like Texas making it harder for mobile polling locations. All of these things are to create longer lines because they know when you create those longer lines, you're going to hit young voters, college students, and you're going to hit Black voters harder than you're going to hit anyone else.
Right, and of course, those people are more inclined to vote for Democrats. Marc, can this decision by this federal judge be appealed, and what do you expect that process to look like?
Yeah, so Georgia has already filed a notice of appeal to bring the case to the 11th Circuit. So that process is already underway. So, the timing of that, I assume, will play out over the next few months, and we will see what the 11th Circuit does or doesn't do probably by the end of the year. But remember, the 11th Circuit, even though it has historically been a fairly conservative circuit, thanks to President Biden, is now a much more balanced circuit in terms of appointees. And in the Florida case, where you had some similar restrictions, different but similar, the Florida Supreme Court upheld the trial. I'm sorry, the 11th Circuit upheld a portion of the trial court that dealt with a different kind of restriction on line warming. But so I have hope at the 11th Circuit.
We're also following the case that challenges the maps in Georgia. Do you have an update on that?
Yeah, those maps are unconstitutional, or they violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, or both. And there's one question I get over and over and over again. I got it just yesterday from someone. How is it that the Republicans in Alabama are violating a court order? And the reason why I say this about Georgia is because the Georgia case is very similar to the Alabama case. The maps in Georgia are violate the law for the same reasons and just as egregiously as the maps in Alabama. So the short answer to your question is, I expect that later this fall, the Georgia trial court will strike down the maps there and require the creation of an additional African-American district outside of Atlanta. But the real question, Brian, that people, like I said, keep asking me is, okay, but if that happens, will the Republicans actually obey the law? And so what I want to assure everyone is that courts will give the legislature an opportunity to fix its maps when those maps are struck down. But at the end of the day, I can promise, whether it's Alabama or Louisiana or Georgia, we will make sure, the lawyers involved in those cases will make sure that if the state is recalcitrant and won't follow Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act or the U.S. Constitution and a court order, we will be dogged and make sure that for 2024 there is relief. So everyone following Alabama, have patience. People following Georgia, have hope.
Now, we've seen Brian Kemp, who is the governor of Georgia, being floated as this moderate Republican alternative to Donald Trump and the Trump wing of the Republican Party. Based on the laws that you've had a lot of experience litigating against, based on the laws that Brian Kemp has signed into law, is he as moderate as his branding would suggest?
No, Brian Kemp is an unrepentant vote suppressor. So let me say the nicest thing I can say about Brian Kemp. He did not join a felony racketeering enterprise.
Yeah, bar's pretty low these days.
So that's what I could say about Brian Kemp, is that he did not join a conspiracy to deprive Georgians their right to vote. He did not join a state-level racketeering enterprise. But beyond that, Brian Kemp is just an absolute proud card-carrying vote suppressor. I mean, Brian Kemp supported SB 202. Brian Kemp endorsed SB 202. Brian Kemp is defending SB 202. Brian Kemp likes voter suppression laws. So there is no hero to be found in the governor's mansion of Georgia. Remember him sitting in front of that painting of a plantation when he signed SB 202. Like, he's not a good guy. Yeah. He is, as I said, I'll end with a compliment. He is not currently under indictment in Georgia or federally because he did not join a felony conspiracy to deprive people of the right to vote or a racketeering enterprise in Georgia.
Yeah, well, they don't call the party of law and order for nothing. So there you go. Brian Kemp's just doing what he can. Well, Marc, thank you to you and your team for the work that you've been doing, especially representing the plaintiffs in a lot of these cases regarding these new maps and violations of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. For anybody watching, if you want to help Marc, then please sign up for Democracy Docket. It is the free news outlet that Marc founded to keep you up to date on everything voting and elections. The link is right here on the screen. It's also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.